Welcome, everyone. This is a webinar entitled Building Effective Environmental Policy, and it's being conducted by Network for Business Sustainability. This is a re-recording of a webinar which was conducted on January 12, 2012. Thank you for joining us, and we're absolutely delighted to be able to present the results of a systematic review on the topic of building effective environmental policy that the Network for Business Sustainability conducted throughout 2010. The report, the executive summary, as well as the full systematic review can be found on our website, nbs.net, and we would encourage you to visit that site and check under our Knowledge tab for both this and other reports that we've completed, which are freely available. Just a little bit of context before we begin. The Network for Business Sustainability is a not-for-profit organization, and we are working in the space between academic research and science and business sustainability decision-making. Ours is a virtual network of over 2,400 members made up of both researchers, industry executives, and students. We really have a world-class group of sustainability thinkers within the network, and our reach is global. Our network is hosted by the Richard Ivey School of Business, and our primary source of funding is federal government money, so there's a very strong public mandate to what we do. So in this mission to bridge the gap between research and science and business decision-making, we conduct research studies on the topic of sustainability, and then we translate the findings into executive-friendly tools and resources. Our research agenda is set by a leadership council, and this is a group of 18 sustainability thought leaders from industry, government, and NGOs. All of our resources are publicly available, and you are welcome to download them from our website, www.mbs.net. So here you can see the cover of our systematic review. It's entitled Building Effective Environmental Policy, a Guideline for Decision Making. Our purpose today is to take you through the findings on this important topic. And this topic was identified as a priority by our Leadership Council, and their hope was to gain knowledge and resources to address this very difficult barrier to the sustainability movement in Canada. The contributors to the research included our research team from Carleton University. We have Graham Ald on the line with us today. There were also members of a guidance committee drawn from industry. We had Industry Canada, Unilever, Wholesome, and the Sustainable Prosperity Institute represented, as well as two external advisors to oversee the research project. Our research agenda explains how we'll spend our time over the next short while. We'll explain a bit about our research process. We'll share our lessons learned and high-level findings, and then we will lead you through the important tools that we've developed to help address this question around building effective environmental policy. We do have some questions which have been posed, and we'll also address those to our researcher. And this webinar, as you know, is being recorded, so you may refer to it at any time. This slide shows the research team. Today we have Graham on the line because we are re-recording, but he was assisted by Dr. Bob Slater and Dr. Alexandra Mallet, both from Carleton, and you can see their pictures here. So I'm going to turn it over to Graham now, who will begin to lead us through the research.
Great. Thanks, Barb. So our report is based on a careful and comprehensive review of existing research that has examined the real-world effects of climate change policies. In this brief presentation, I'm going to review three aspects of our study. I begin with the approach we took for the research. Second, I will detail key trends the research identified. Third, I discuss two outputs from the analysis that have particular relevance to policymakers and businesses, namely a decision tree and an assessment of when different policies do and do not perform well. To close, I'll just offer a few key conclusions. Turning to our approach, we aim to address an important knowledge gap. We know the tools of government are changing. More and more, businesses and non-governmental organizations are working in cooperation with government, and sometimes alone, to address environmental problems. But we don't know much about the lessons learned from the real-world effects of this expanded set of governance tools and their relationships with standard policy instruments, such as regulation. Our comprehensive study begins to fill this gap. Our scan of existing research was guided by two criteria. First, we wanted to examine the issue of climate change. Since this is a broad and diverse policy problem with consequences for human health, the economy, and the environment, we focused on only two climate-related problems. First, the promotion of low-carbon technology, and second, water management in the context of climate change. We expected different policies might work well for one problem and less so for the other, but wanted to verify this based on research findings. Our second criteria directed us to examine only studies using empirical analysis to identify the real-world effects of policies in practice. We excluded studies which presented forecasts of how policies might work. Based on these criteria, we scanned nearly 900 slides, or 900 studies, listed in various academic and governmental databases. As this slide illustrates, 204 studies fit our criteria and serve as a basis for the report. Next slide, please. Each qualifying study was reviewed carefully by our team. Our review focused on collecting information on four issues, namely, the problem characteristics. We classified each study based on whether it focused on low-carbon technology or water management. Agenda setting. We paid close attention to what the studies identified as factors which helped bring the issue to the policy agenda. Was it due to a focusing event, such as Hurricane Katrina, a change in public opinion, a shift in the value of some important indicator? Instrument characteristics. The policies were classified based on a number of criteria, including whether they were administered by public and or private authorities, the type of instrument, regulation, information provision, or expenditure, and the target of the policy, be it government, corporations, or citizens. Lastly, we differentiated between evaluations examining the costs and benefits or cost effectiveness of policies, the impacts on the environmental problem, such as reductions of greenhouse gas emissions, and the process, specifically whether the policy faced challenges owing to design flaws or constraints on implementation. Here we also noted any implications the studies made about accountability. As the diagram illustrates, we wanted to understand how aspects of the context, specifically agenda setting, problem characteristics, and instrument design, affected the evaluations of different policies. Next slide, please. Reviewing the studies provided a number of insights. Let me review three. First, the study showed that flexibility is more effective than rigidity. We observed two types of flexibility. For low-carbon technology, built-in flexibility involves policies designed to allow different approaches to achieving the same goal. For example, giving firms flexibility to decide how to achieve an emissions reduction target. One firm, for instance, might install a new energy-efficient technology, while another might choose to purchase emissions offset credits. With water management, built-in flexibility meant accounting for changing circumstances through adaptive measures written into the policy or program from the start. 55% of the policies with built-in flexibility were evaluated as efficient compared to only 42% of the policies lacking flexibility. This discrepancy is more pronounced for impact evaluations. 52% with flexibility were seen to accomplish their goals, while only 15% of policies lacking flexibility had done so. Second, the studies found using money as an incentive or disincentive works well. Expenditure instruments were found to achieve their desired impact in 59% of the cases. These instruments performed poorly in only 11% of the reviewed policies. Regulatory instruments, by contrast, worked in 45% of the cases reviewed and performed poorly in 30%. Research has generally concluded that when companies are required to use specific technologies, they won't have incentives to search for more effective or efficient solutions. Third, the studies show how policy's effectiveness can vary depending on its target. Of those policies targeting government, 55% were seen as effective, compared with just 29% of those targeting firms. With citizens, 48% of policies were considered effective. But there was a marked difference between evaluations of low-carbon policies and water management policies when governments were the target. Low-carbon policies received higher proportion of positive evaluations in this case. Next slide, please.
Okay, Graham, thank you. That sounds terrific. I was wondering if I might ask you a couple of questions to help illustrate what we've been chatting about.
Certainly.
So you've talked about various ways that policies might be evaluated. Can you provide an example of how impact, efficiency, and accountability concerns might interact for a particular policy?
Yes, this is a great question. Our study, and also just conceptually, there are many instances where this might happen, where they will interact. For example, if the public is concerned about greenhouse gas emissions, or a country has made an international commitment to reduce emissions, how well a policy does in reaching this goal is, of course, relevant when we're considering accountability of elected officials. But, of course, falling short of our goals may occur for other reasons other than poorly designed or implemented policies. There may be some external factor out of control of the decision makers, which has some effect on whether the goal is achieved. So it's important, as a consequence, to be careful about pointing fingers and seeking to hold decision makers accountable, because there might be some other external factor that was involved in causing an evaluation to show that a policy had failed. So hence the evaluation is critical, and pulling apart the different forms is something that our research sought to do.
Okay, great. One more question at this point, Graham.
Sure.
If government builds flexibility into policies, they risk being viewed as making concessions to business. How does your research help policymakers justify such decisions?
Yeah, this is a good one. I think one of the lessons our research points to is that it's actually pretty difficult to make judgments on the value of a policy only focusing on one aspect, such as flexibility. So really, effectiveness needs to take into account a broader view. And as we discuss later in the presentation, bundles of policies are something that we found as being a key factor that decision makers need to take into account. But more specific to the question, there are different kinds of flexibility, as I alluded to a moment ago, and these will have different implications for whether flexibility is likely to improve the performance of a policy. So on the one hand, many studies noted that flexibility can help reduce costs of achieving a given policy goal. If a company is required individually or collectively to meet some level of emissions reduction, allowing firms to innovate and find different ways to achieve the reduction, studies indicate that in that case the costs of compliance are going to fall. But it's critical in those situations that the ambition of the policy is really large if it's going to have effects on the actual problem. And in the other case, another form of flexibility might be giving companies the opportunity to decide what the goal should be. And in this case, most of the studies highlight that this kind of flexibility is usually not associated with helping achieve substantial environmental outcomes.
Okay, great. Thank you, Graham. That's helpful. Why don't we continue with the presentation and take more questions in a bit?
Certainly. Great. So, To turn to the next part of the presentation, one of the things we tried to do was to make the research more actionable was to develop a policy framework, and this diagram illustrates its three parts. They were the policy environment, the issue life cycle, and cross-cutting policy functions. In the slides to follow, I'm going to discuss a decision tool focused on the policy development and selection stage of the issue life cycle, as this is a really important stage where policy options are formulated and evaluated, with one ultimately coming to the fore as the choice to move forward with. But before turning to this, I'm just going to briefly discuss the framework to provide a little bit of context. So the policy environment, put simply, includes drivers of a policy problem and the broader context affecting the problem, such as trends in technological change and demographics. Changing Canadian public opinion about climate change is an example of a relevant driver for our study. The issue life cycle is a simple model of thinking about how a policy problem is identified, defined, addressed, and monitored to assess whether an appropriate solution has been found and leads ultimately to ameliorating the original problem. So I'll return to the stages when discussing our decision tree. But finally, the cross-cutting functions are relevant across all the stages of the issue life cycle. Communication is essential to ensure all parties are informed and aware of the issue, the evidence, the goals, and the status of performance by all relevant parties. Related, it is critical to build consensus among the different people and institutions relevant along the issue life cycle. Success or otherwise at one stage will influence the ability to create consensus elsewhere. More broadly, governance is a cross-cutting requirement that entails the organization and exercise of authority involving governments, business, and civil society organizations to achieve agreed-to, coordinated, and integrated results. On the more operational level, management practices are necessary to organize work, set priorities, obtain and allocate resources, and account for changes of performance and make necessary adjustments as warranted. Finally, the success of any enterprise is dependent on securing the services of competent, energetic, and committed people, skilled in core technical capacities, integrated thinking, adaptive management, and with strategic outlooks. Next slide, please. Let me now discuss our decision tool. As I just noted, it focuses on a key stage in the life cycle of any given policy issue, the policy development and selection stage. At this stage, we identify 5 issues decision makers need to consider. The reviewed studies provided lessons about key issues affecting each step. The steps are: 1. Has a diagnostic been completed, and is it sufficient? 2. What performance measurements should the policy be evaluated against? 3. What are the most effective policies from a design perspective? 4. What policies are easiest to implement? And finally, 5. Selection and consideration for implementation, performance measurement, and results. Next slide, please. We use the differences between the problems of promoting low-carbon technology and addressing water management in the context of climate change to provide guidance for decision makers to consider at each step. All of these are detailed in the table you see in the slides. For instance, at the diagnostic step, the review provided 2 instructive insights, namely, first, understand the nature of the uncertainty for the issue, and second, determine whether the issue is an end and/or a means to an end. Let me briefly elaborate on the first. With the issue of uncertainty, many studies on low-carbon technology stressed how critical it is to recognize uncertainty about the way households, individuals, or companies will respond to policies promoting the use of certain technologies. Will a user of an energy-efficient appliance use the appliance in a way that reduces energy use? Or will their behavior adapt to the new technology with uncertain consequences for energy saving? The answer to this question will, of course, have implications for how effective a low-carbon technology is in bringing about behavioral change and affecting aggregate energy use, not to mention greenhouse gas emissions. With water management, in contrast, the uncertainty discussed in many studies surrounded the biophysical system. The frequency and or severity of flood events or drought events, the spatial distribution of these events, and the uncertain implications of this variability for planning decisions to do with infrastructure, industrial and household water use, among others. This is just one illustration from our analysis. The rest you can find in the full report, which is available on NBS's website. Next slide, please.
Okay, Graham, so there's a lot of information there. I'm wondering if I can ask you a couple of more questions.
Sure.
So imagine that I'm a manager working in the area of external relations. How could I apply this environmental policy framework to my work with government?
It's a great question, too. I think there's really two ways that it would be relevant. First, it's a general decision tool about policy, and so in that respect, the tool could be applied to the decisions within a firm. Certain aspects of the guidance in our report set out how decisions in general could be made, and so some of the general principles that we came to would be relevant to internal decisions within a company. But more importantly, I think, secondly, it provides guidance on the importance of engaging with government policymakers, not just at one stage, but at all the stages of an issue's life cycle. So in the closing part of the report, we have some more details on this, and specifically we highlight that it's really never too early to engage, and a familiarity with the decision tool should, we hope, provide various stakeholders, such as businesses, an opportunity to think about how they might more effectively engage with policy decision makers.
Okay, perfect. Got it. Thank you. And another question, Graham. Based on your research and experience, what is the number one thing business can do to help government arrive at a better policy? And then secondly, what's the number one thing that policymakers can do?
This, again, really interesting question. My own sense from what we found and the consensus that came out of our study as a team is that this idea of thinking about one way or one piece of advice is the wrong way to think about this question or these issues. That really there isn't one thing. Rather, both policymakers and businesses, if they are to take our framework seriously, will need to consider a number of factors simultaneously. So a short answer to the question is that government and businesses can't just think of one thing to arrive at better policy, but they have to have a more comprehensive perspective. So climate change, I think, is actually a great case to illustrate this, since it touches on so many facets of the economy, society, the environment, and it's going to play out over years, decades, and centuries to come. So from the bark beetle outbreaks in the west to the melting permafrost in Canada's north to algae blooms in the Great Lakes, the effects, both direct and indirect, of a problem like climate change are really going to confront approaches that try to find a simple single solution, but rather our decision tool and the report hopefully will get decision makers thinking about how we need to think about this complexity in a comprehensive way in order to really improve bundles of policies that we bring to bear on this challenge.
Okay, great. Thank you, Graham. So why don't we go back to the presentation? I know you have some more pieces to describe for us.
Sure. Great. So the final section of our report identifies when different policies do and do not perform well. In the slide that you see here, we've provided just two examples, and of course there are many more in the report that we hope you'll reference. So to the examples on the table, first, with low-carbon technology, a number of studies provided assessments of emissions trading schemes. These identified how these schemes had worked well when enough emitters were included to ensure gains from trade and avoid any one emitter having market power. Performance was poor when baseline data on emissions was hard to obtain or credibly verify, and when enforcement was lacking. With water management, integrative and or adaptive management were a frequently turned to instrument for addressing water management challenges associated with climate change. Strong stakeholder and public engagement were a key source of success, which underscores from our framework our emphasis on consensus building, governance, and communication as cross-cutting functions. Good data is also critical for these challenges. These water management approaches struggled, by contrast, when discussions focused on engineering issues and concerns of high water users to the exclusion of other experts such as water ecologists, and when the processes do not consider how the pressure on the water source might change or will change in the future. Next slide, please. So to conclude, the report drew several general takeaway messages that have broad relevance to businesses, policymakers, and other stakeholders. I'm just going to review a few to close, and of course the rest are available in the report. First, the experiences of countries such as Germany gave weight to the point that all actors need to take a long-term vision. One-shot policies are ill-suited to deal with the challenges of climate change, as I just mentioned to the previous question. Rather, our review found again and again studies noting that it is important that these issues are tackled on a long-term and sustained basis, with decision-makers accounting for the changes in context and information fed back from first-generation policy interventions. Second, it is important to focus on opportunities rather than obstacles. The city of Rotterdam, for instance, benefited from the results of an international architectural and design event which brought together engineers, designers, and policymakers in a manner which facilitated an out-of-the-box solution to managing rising sea level and increasing flood intensity. It came up with a plan to integrate management of floods with urban design, creating waterways and parks that also served as a distributed network of overflow water storage. Third, we note the importance of policy bundles, as I've mentioned already. These being combinations of regulation, expenditure, and information policies with the governing efforts of the private sector. Government, business, and NGOs have access to particular authorities and skills and will be best suited to act in specific domains. The policy mix will shift over time as the issue moves through its life cycle and as experience is gained. Progress will be best sustained when the combined efforts of all parties is aligned to a common purpose. A fourth takeaway stresses the importance of performance monitoring. Policies that incorporate mandatory reporting requirements perform best. Much is to be learned from tracking implementation and the ultimate environmental results, and the application of adaptive management practices will provide the feedback necessary for continuous improvement by all parties. Thanks for listening, and I think there might be a few more questions that I'll address now. Do you have some more questions, Barb?
I do. I have a couple more questions, Graham, so thank you for that. One question, can you give us an example of an effective low-carbon policy and why it has worked?
That's a great question. Let me just think for a second, which would be a good one. I think probably one of the best comparisons that our report highlights is the difference between the U.S. and Germany.
Right.
Each country has used similar policies over the course of the last 4 decades to try and create incentives for the adoption of and development of low-carbon technologies. However, there have been some pretty important differences that we discuss in greater length in the report. First, the U.S. federal support was inconsistent over time, It was really high in the 1970s following the oil crisis, but it fell dramatically in the 1980s. And quite a few studies noted that this lack of continuity of attention was a pretty important stumbling block for stimulating low-carbon technological development in the U.S. In Germany, on the other hand, support was initially low, but it's been sustained and has grown over time. Second, there's an interesting difference in terms of who bears the risk of renewable markets. So in Germany, it's fixed feed-in tariff and guaranteed access to the electrical grid to sell new renewable sources created a much more stable investment environment in the renewable energy sector. Whereas in the U.S., this kind of stability was not as consistent and reliable over time. So that contrast is quite a useful illustration of how certain different characteristics of policies really led to success and not as good performance across different countries.
Great. Okay. Thanks, Graham. And here's our last question. We're all familiar with the EU's ETS. What are some of the key lessons Canadian policymakers and businesses can take from global emissions trading schemes?
Great. So I think there's a couple of lessons. Well, there are many lessons, but just a few that I'll note. First, I think the nature of the target is important. So a number of studies noted that ambiguous targets or loose targets undermine the effectiveness of emissions trading. And this of course, is a point of concern for certain industries, as unlike emissions tax or an emissions tax, which sets a clear price per unit of emission, trading schemes set an absolute cap on the amount of emissions. And then the market determines what the value of the permit is. So if the cap is very tight, i.e. there are few aggregate emissions are permitted, the price will be higher. If the cap is very loose, the size very loose, then there's going to be a lot of emissions and the price will be low. So in those cases, the uncertainty about the price signal that will come out of trading versus a tax is a key variable that we found has an effect on sort of how companies respond to this kind of instrument. But there's much more detail provided in the report on this, so I would direct listeners to Table 4.2 in the complete report.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, Graham. That was great. A very thorough and easy to listen to description of what's in the report. So this concludes our webinar. Please do visit our website, www.nbs.net, for this and other resources. And I just want to take a moment and thank our funders, the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, and our Leadership Council. Many thanks, and thanks to you, Graham, and your full research team for this important piece of work.
Thank you.